Brink was set to light the multiplayer shooter gaming world on fire. With the first one-button mantle parkour system featured in a shooter and a objective-focused game mode, an ode to the classic Wolfenstein, Brink, developed by Splash Damage and published by Bethesda Softworks, would launch May 9th, 2011, and although it had all the hype and signs pointing toward a massive new successful shooter IP, like Titanfall for a time or later on Overwatch, but, well, things didn't go according to plan, and that's a bit of an understatement. After a mere few months, Brink was already seemingly abandoned by its player base. And yet, it still finds itself as one of the most requested games in my series, so for many of you who didn't follow its story the first time, you're likely wondering why a failed multiplayer shooter managed to stoke so many emotions. Well, we will find out that, and why Brink failed to keep flight despite so much momentum on this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we take the largest contributing factors to a game's death, which we determine through navigating a timeline of events and gathering clues, and then combine it all for a final deduction at the end of the video, every detective's favorite, where we crack the case. Choose your class and body type for this unique shooter that helped pave the way for many modern shooters, at least in some aspects. The story begins back in the mid-2000s. Yes, it turns out that Brink is actually a fairly old project, from an even older developer, Splash Damage, known for their genre-defining Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, which was the multiplayer component to Wolfenstein back in 2003. Reportedly, Brink was originally set and planned for a spring 2009 launch, which tells us that the game had at least 2 years of development up until that point. It was clear that Splash Damage was investing tons into Brink being their next genre definer. The reason I spend so much time focusing on the origins of Brink is, well, it's part of the job of being a detective, is that when it comes to a market, timing is absolutely crucial. The more Brink would be delayed, the more theoretically it would be phased out in aspects of gameplay, graphics, and potentially more. For example, even design or the content offering. And that's the thing, despite Brink being remembered as a super hyped up shooter meant to change the very scene itself, most are unaware it faced a lot of issues in development, including multiple delays. After announcing the game and its upcoming launch, Brink was delayed yet again in 2010. At this point, there wasn't even gameplay that had surfaced yet, and the only thing about the game in serious detail was it following the typical objective-focused style that Splash Damage was kind of known for. That would be remedied January 2011 with the release of mini-game details and gameplay as well. The video would showcase how much customization was possible in Brink, which has arguably always been one of its major strengths. Let's talk about the gameplay in Brink. What made it so special? Well, let's get the smart system out of the way, because at the time, it kind of was revolutionary. Meanwhile, fast forward to modern times, and nearly every shooter and action game has something similar. The smart system is a essentially one-button mantle system that you play in all the modern games these days, but back in 2011. The customization also wasn't just about customizing guns like most games. In Brink, you could also customize your body size and shape, which would also influence gameplay. The matches themselves would play out in typical SD fashion, with multiple main objectives you must complete that are the main focus of the game. Add on a unique quest system that would allow classes to pick up quests and get XP for class-specific quests. For example, a medic could get a quest to heal or res a player. It was a novel system, though how in-depth it would translate to would remain to be seen. But it would serve as the core gameplay for Brink, making it far more of a squad-based shooter needing team synergy with the soldier, medic, engineer, and operative classes. All of these classes would have unique roles and unique abilities. For example, an engineer would have anywhere from abilities that allow them to spawn a light turret, to buffing their Kevlar, to also putting mines out. And engineers were needed to pass certain parts of the main objective as well. After the main objective was complete, the players would often move to another phase of the same map, featuring a different objective. And to be honest, for Quake nerds like myself, this is ringing all kinds of alarm bells. That's because Quake had a very similar sounding game made that was a spin-off to the main series dubbed Quake Wars. The irony is, guess who the developer of Quake Wars was? Well, you guessed it. It was Splash Damage. Splash Damage would launch Enemy Territory Quake Wars. I hid the name, as you guys could imagine, because otherwise you would have just guessed it, back in 2007, and while it would create a cult following of sorts and score well from critics, including myself as a gamer in that equation, it would ultimately fail to keep a long-lasting audience and make a long-lasting impact. I think there's a lot to like about Quake Wars, and it probably deserves its own video, to be honest, but there's also just tons of jank in that game. It's that classic scenario of if you liked it, you loved it, while if you were outside of the Quake universe, there was a very small chance that you would enjoy the game. Perhaps Brink was not Quake Wars in disguise, but SD's attempt to make a Quake Wars style game for a more general gamer and shooter audience. That was also their own unique IP. Whatever the case there, Quake Wars would serve as a constant reminder to many classic shooter fans playing Brink in the future, at what more could have been possible, I think at least, and how little Brink really changes the formula or evolves it from Quake Wars. After multiple delays and a set of trailers and a big advertising push, Brink would launch on Xbox 360, PS3, and PC globally May 10th through the 12th. That's my easy way of saying that it didn't launch globally at the same time. On aggregate review website Metacritic, Brink would score a 68 out of 100 from 85 different critical reviews. This was a middling score, especially for the expectations that were set for the game, and it had a massive reception critically. So it's not like it was a case of people not covering it. People were covering Brink and they just weren't really that impressed. We will take a look at 2 reviews in particular, starting with IGN's 6 out of 10 review of Brink. IGN in their review would state that the game was lacking in variety, depth, and overall addictiveness they thought that it needed to succeed long-term. IGN, like many other critics, would enjoy the parkour system, easily done by the press of a button, but feel like it wasn't enough in the game to be a core feature or be advertised as one, because when you kind of got into the game, you're surprised that there wasn't more things to mantle or parkour. And even then, if there was, is that even enough to just carry a shooter that's kind of lacking elsewhere? I want to point out a website that I and most of you have probably never heard of, but for good reason I think. Media Stinger in their review made a bombshell of a statement that lit a light bulb in my head and then some. First, they made a very obvious realization, the same one that I made when I covered Titanfall before this project. The single player in Brink is a glorified multiplayer campaign, and for more reasons than just one, it's just not content-wise the same, and the AI for single player play in Brink is abysmal, and they don't even try to complete the objective. This makes the de facto best way to play Brink with other players, which makes sense and all. It's a class shooter. But why even include the single player in the first place? And why hype it up to be something that it wasn't? Because that's the thing, Splash Damage did hype it up. They kept talking about how, no, looking at it like single player multiplayer is the simplistic way. We're making a single player that's able to be expanded into multiplayer, except that's not really what we got. The cutscenes are glorified camera angles, and that was something that another shooter, Lost Planet 2, already got flack for launching the year before. So Splash Damage didn't even seem to learn from those lessons at all. But this isn't the huge light bulb moment I mentioned. That moment came when I read this review and remembered that one of my favorite shooters, Killzone 3, basically had a fully playable, fully voiced, and storied single player and multiplayer. And one of those gameplay modes for multiplayer was a literal objective-based mode similar to Brink's gameplay mode and the only mode it had. The issue being, as the review postulates, Killzone 3 was a complete game in a franchise. Meanwhile, Brink had one mode, 8 maps, which is less than Killzone's maps, and Brink was still asking for basically the same price, $50 for a game that was one game mode. It just wasn't a good value proposition, not when a sea of other shooters were coming out that year. I mean, we had BF3, Modern Warfare 3, and then some other Sony shooters like Killzone 3, SOCOM 4, Resistance 3, Payday the Heist, and so on. There's even more shooters than that, and that's an absurd amount of them for some reason that launched in this year. And you get it. You get the idea. The competition was great. But good competition also lets us know where the other games stand up and if they can last. Now sure, being an existing IP helps there a lot, but simply put, Brink wasn't offering anything unique enough in its own right, one button, mantle or not, to make a lasting impact, much like IGN had stated. And worse, at least in my opinion, was that Brink just wasn't that impressive of a shooter either. The guns shot eerily similar to each other, and the sounds are pretty plasticky. The aiming in the game feels pretty dated, and almost like a mobile shooter of sorts with a big giant reticule. And the abilities for the classes as well just feel very lackluster, making the whole hook of the teamwork and abilities kind of a weak one. Even as a shooter fan, looking for a new IP to try out, Brink just was a lackluster experience and I didn't purchase the game. Things weren't looking too positive for Brink either, because the difficult thing about a multiplayer shooter with a box price is that even when they sell enough copies to recoup some of their losses and maybe even break even, they could lose the majority of that player base that's much needed to sustain that said multiplayer shooter base. SD was saying that PC was giving them some light in comparison to the console, but the reason that I constantly see that as a negative thing whenever you're trying to make console versions of a game is because you have to simplify the game for console. And there could have been negatives from that as well. For starters, when the game was first playable on PC, the netcode issues were so bad that they had to literally pull the max count of players down and fill the rest of it with bots. That's something that maybe happens during a test, like an open beta, and even then, maybe not for a game that had been delayed for 2 years. So the console play didn't even really seem entirely worth it, and what PC audience was there, and majority, was still getting a largely subpar experience. While MMOs and virtual worlds are known for rocky launches and oftentimes forgiven for such, every hour or minute a shooter is unplayable and can't offer the best experience it should, there's much higher chances that the population will drop off a cliff and not make a proper comeback either, not unlike a dying virtual world. The point being, though, is that rocky launches are a near-death sentence for a new shooter IP, especially one that was already struggling to keep the players that it could bring in, because things were only going to get worse. Like many shooters who launch without enough core features to impress the shooter audience, Brink was no different, missing a clan mode, alternative game modes, and how much the guns just felt the same. While these are actually changes that could be fixed over time, would the Brink fanbase even be willing to stick around for that long? The answer to that was a resounding no, after Splash Damage would announce a series of paid DLCs. And while these are pretty affordable for DLC prices, $9.99 for the Agents of Change DLC, which would include 2 new maps, 5 abilities, 2 new attachments, and 2 archetypes, and it would also raise the level cap for 2 weeks, and allow in those 2 weeks for people to play it for free, which is a great idea and a great way to entice people to buy a DLC and support the community and the developer. But the issue is that it just feels like a publisher requirement that doesn't really match the circumstance or scenario. It's tone deaf. Brink fans weren't wanting to buy DLCs. They were wanting a completed game, and they didn't want to have to pay more money to have it completed either. Bethesda would even try to bring in some big guns and leverage Doom and Fallout with crossover packs to not much avail. Brink's population after the first 6 months of live was falling off of a cliff, and while the game wasn't on Steam or somewhere that we could track the population, at best we know that the game ultimately, according to SD themselves, reached 2.5 million players worldwide after 1 year of life. While I think that this number could be inflated, it gives us the only official number we got concerning Brink. If you're wondering about my skepticism, first it's always helpful to have a level of skepticism regarding population data when it's not really officially disclosed much, but my skepticism comes from the feeling of, well, if it was 2.5 million players, not only is that impressive for a new IP from an old developer, there should be plenty of players to still work with. Unless, well, most of those players weren't sticking around, so almost in a sense, the CEO disclosing the sales made it more obvious how much Brink was actually struggling. Just maybe not immediately. Splash Damage, however, instead of sticking by Brink and continuing to work on the project either because of the lack of success that it had or their contract work being up, would launch another objective-based class shooter hero shooter, this time dubbed Dirty Bomb, and released only on PC. Dirty Bomb would be a far more positively received game than Brink, and basically outperform the game in nearly every aspect. Because of this, it's hard to completely be negative about SD wanting to pivot to it, especially since it was a free-to-play game by contrast. But it still has to be acknowledged that SD wasn't fighting the good fight for Brink and was moving on to something bigger and better, and a new publishing deal with Nexon. SD being an independent studio means that they need to keep making games to make money. When a game doesn't do well, they can't stick by it past a point. So by design, in a sense, as a company, they don't have a choice but to properly move on if they want to keep their company going. That doesn't change the fact that they basically fully abandoned Brink for Dirty Bomb, and eventually over time would leave Dirty Bomb as well, making it seem more of like a move of habit for Splash Damage. Perhaps because of them not being able to take those good ideas that they start with and fully execute them in the long term. A number of years would pass before Brink would be finally moved to free-to-play, and I'm saying like a number of years, which is why it feels a bit like gross negligence. Brink would launch on Steam, and still manage to reach an impressive 16,000 players. However, just after 1 year, that population would drop down to 6,000, before falling off a cliff the next year to under 1,000 players. Brink's servers are actually still officially running, and although the game basically has no players right now, you can still play the single player with bots if you're willing to do the majority of the work. Or perhaps host a dedicated server to play with some of your friends, or just play with them online. However, Brink hasn't received any updates since its DLC, and it didn't receive any updates post its Steam free-to-play launch either, so it's pretty safe to say, with 4 players playing right now, that Brink died. Something I wanted to bring attention to because at this point I have experience working and covering more than one Splash Damage title, and I'm also an OG fan of their Enemy Territory's major hit, back as a wee nerd playing with my other fellow nerds. I admire their dedication to the objective-based shooter gameplay, the same one that I enjoy. However, I think that it's clear that the company isn't evolving that much. While Dirty Bomb was an improvement to Brink, in the end it suffered from many of the same problems and more, and wasn't properly handled at all. Splash Damage is like one of those interesting companies, much like the Hi-Rez or Hi-Rez whatever in the current iteration, who can make something fun and special, but can't seem to keep the game going for a very long time. I can't help but feel like that's a skill issue, or at least in combination of the skills that they have, or maybe the ones that they lack. And no, this isn't just an issue of needing a better manager. You also need somebody who not only manages, but can also lead. And in my opinion, Splash Damage seems to suffer from not having a public-facing or strong leader, but they aren't a company without talent, clearly. Because of this, regardless of their 2 covered failures, they're still working on 2 new titles that have potential to be something big. First, we have a Transformers game called Reactivate, an online action game set in the Transformers universe, and second, we have Project Astrid, which is Splash Damage teaming up with well-known and respected gaming YouTubers Sacriel and Shroud. I think this is a smart idea from the SD team. Not only are they not putting all of their eggs in just one basket, for starters, and second, they're trying to find a way to stay relevant and modern, but enlisting in the help of well-known and prolific shooter YouTubers and content creators. And besides those 2 projects and their fate, SD at the very least has a history of helping Xbox with games like Halo MCC, the Gears of War franchise on multiplayer, so they're still quite well known and recognized as being that multiplayer developer who helps others with their multiplayer, which is exactly what Enemy Territory was in the first place. But making their own unique game that becomes successful that they can manage to actually maintain that success has always evaded them. With that music playing, we have reached the end of this mystery, detectives, and we have gathered more than enough clues already. But if you weren't paying attention, what are the largest contributing factors to the failure of Brink? Poor management and handling, delayed development and launch, a lack of content and standard shooter features. Netcode issues destroyed the launch momentum. Lackluster shooter gameplay. A lack of core feature hooks, or at least strong ones. As I have already stated, Splash Damage is still kicking and very likely has the chance to turn yet another IP into a smash hit. But I really have my eyes on that Project Astrid project. Partly because of my personal curiosity as a fellow content creator, but also because it is another attempt by Splash Damage to make a unique IP. And something tells me if Splash Damage is able to find the success that they need and want with a unique IP, and if they learn from the mistakes of their Brink and Dirty Bomb games, they really have a chance to make something big, and keep getting it bigger. That's what she said. Thanks for watching.